The young cashier, seeing the old veteran, at first reacted mockingly to his appearance and past, but his attitude changed when a military helicopter landed on the roof of the store and a general stepped out. The general, with the presence of power and respect, came to right the wrong and return Jacob the debt of honor and respect that he had long deserved. He reminded everyone of how often silent heroes remain invisible to society. If this story touched you deeply, comment. Respect for everyone. Jacob had returned to a small town in Iowa, a place where the flat, open fields stretched endlessly in every direction, and the roads seemed to disappear into nothingness. It was a town that time had forgotten, where the pulse of the world outside felt distant, muffled by the silence that hung in the air. In 2023, the town still held the same steady rhythm it had for decades, a rhythm that was never disturbed by the rush of modern life. There were no sirens, no honking horns, no rush of traffic, just the quiet hum of wind across the plains and the occasional chirp of birds that seemed to know nothing but peace. Jacob lived at the far edge of this town, in an old house that looked as though it had been there long before he had even thought to settle in it. The house, worn by the years and weathered by time, was not a home in the traditional sense. It wasn't a place of warmth or joy, but rather a refuge. It wasn't built for family dinners or gatherings. It was built to shield him from the world that he no longer understood, the world that had moved on while he remained anchored in the past. The house stood as a testament to his own solitude, as though its walls had absorbed the weight of the years he had spent away from this quiet life. Jacob had served in Afghanistan for years, a young man who once wore the uniform with pride, the same pride that had carried him through the harrowing days of war. Now, at 84 years old, he was back in this small town, alone, distant, and unseen. His service to his country had been long, but its end had come quietly. There were no grand homecomings, no banners or parades, only the fading echoes of distant memories and the ghosts of comrades who had not returned. He had done his duty, but the world had long forgotten the sacrifices he had made. It wasn't that he wanted recognition or attention. He had never sought that. But the years had left him with a sense of emptiness, a quiet yearning for something that could not be named. Most days, he kept to himself. The town had no need for veterans anymore. The local coffee shop knew him as the quiet old man who always sat in the corner, never speaking, never asking for anything more than a simple meal. His routine was predictable, as was the way the townspeople regarded him. Some nodded in passing, others avoided him altogether. Jacob didn't mind. His life had become a series of small, solitary moments, each one slipping into the next like the gentle flow of a stream. It was a life of quiet acceptance, a life where he could drift, unremarkable and unnoticed. But on one cold afternoon, when the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, Jacob decided to venture into town for something simple, a meal. He wasn't hungry, at least not in the way most people understand hunger, but there was a certain comfort in the ritual of it, a routine he had followed since returning to this town, to this house that no longer felt like a home. He walked the familiar streets, passing the old church, the corner store, and the faded diner where the neon sign flickered weakly in the dusk. He wasn't expecting anything to change that day. It was just another visit to the small-town grocery store. But as Jacob stepped through the door, something felt different, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The store was empty, save for the young cashier who glanced up from his phone and gave Jacob a distracted smile. It was a brief exchange, one that held no warmth, but Jacob was used to it. He moved through the aisles slowly, picking up a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs. As he approached the counter, the cashier's smile faded into something closer to amusement, an expression that spoke more to the young man's indifference than anything else. Jacob paid in silence, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. But as he gathered his change, something happened that would shatter the quiet routine of his life. Outside, the sound of helicopter blades suddenly broke through the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Jacob's heart skipped a beat, an involuntary reaction that came from years of instinct. It wasn't the first time he had heard that sound, but it had been a long time. The noise was different now, though. It was closer, more immediate. For a brief moment, the young cashier looked up from the register, his face flickering with confusion. Jacob didn't wait for him to ask questions. He knew what was coming. The tension in the air seemed to rise, the kind of tension that comes just before something significant happens. The faint sound of a helicopter grew into a roar, and Jacob felt the familiar weight of his past settle over him like a heavy cloak. It wasn't the town's usual kind of noise. It wasn't the kind of noise that belonged here. This was something else. The helicopter landed, the blades cutting through the sky like a knife through the fabric of the evening. Jacob didn't flinch. He had seen this before. Not here, not in this town, but in other places. Places that had their own stories, their own battles, the noise, the suddenness, the arrival of something larger than the world around him. He knew it meant something. The world had come to find him. Jacob entered the supermarket late in the evening, the familiar, sterile chill of the air conditioning greeting him as he pushed through the automatic doors. He was alone, as always, and his movements were methodical, a result of years spent living in routine. His footsteps were quiet on the linoleum floors, a soft tapping that mingled with the hum of the fluorescent lights above. There was no sense of urgency in his stride, no rush to get in and out. He simply walked, as if his body had memorized the path. He moved through the aisles, picking up the few things he needed: a loaf of bread, some eggs, a can of beans. Simple items, the kind of mundane purchases that everyone made without thinking. But for Jacob, even these small tasks were done with a certain detachment, as if he were going through motions that no longer held any real meaning for him. The items were placed carefully in the basket, each one adding to the quiet weight of the evening. When he reached the checkout counter, the young cashier didn't immediately acknowledge him. The man was engrossed in something on his phone, his fingers swiping with absent-minded speed. Jacob placed his items on the counter with a soft clink, the sound breaking the cashier's focus, just enough for him to glance up. The cashier was a young man, probably no older than 25, with bleary eyes and a shiny bald spot on the back of his head. He had the tired look of someone who didn't particularly care about his job, someone who had seen too many late shifts to remain engaged. He looked Jacob over for a moment, his eyes lingering on the older man's worn clothing and the scar that ran down the side of his face, a scar that spoke of something much deeper than any physical wound. The cashier's gaze flickered away quickly, his hands moving to scan the items with mechanical precision. The moment stretched thin, and Jacob waited patiently, his eyes never leaving the young man. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't expect any special treatment, and he didn't need to speak. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken understanding, but also an undeniable distance. Finally, the cashier looked back at him, a faint smirk forming at the corners of his lips, the kind of expression that suggested a joke he was too tired to share. It was a half-hearted attempt at humor, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Something special, veteran?" The words hung in the air, laced with sarcasm. The tone was light, but the undercurrent of mockery was unmistakable. Jacob didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, even detached, as if he had learned long ago to ignore such jabs. He had seen it all before. The way people looked at him, the way they saw him not as a person, but as a relic of a time they didn't understand or care to. He knew the tone of voice, the look of quiet disdain that accompanied it. It was all part of the world he had returned to, a world that had no place for someone like him. Without saying a word, Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out his debit card. He extended it toward the cashier, his hand steady, his grip firm. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to justify anything. The silence that followed was thick, stretching between them, filling the space where words had once been. The cashier took the card without another glance, his fingers brushing against Jacob's for a brief moment. There was a slight hesitation, a subtle shift in his posture, but it was barely noticeable. Jacob could feel it, though, the fleeting change in the air. The young man wasn't laughing anymore. There was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something almost imperceptible. Regret? Shame? Jacob couldn't be sure. But it was there, hidden behind the layers of indifference that the cashier had tried so hard to maintain. As the young man swiped the card and completed the transaction, Jacob remained silent, his gaze distant, focused on something only he could see. He wasn't offended. He wasn't angry. The words didn't hurt, not anymore. It was the weight of the unspoken, the way people didn't know how to interact with him, that had always been the hardest part. The world had moved on, and he was still here, carrying the burden of what had been left behind. The cashier handed him his receipt, his hand trembling slightly as he did. Jacob took it without a word, placing it into his pocket along with the bag of groceries. He didn't acknowledge the man's subtle shift, didn't comment on the change in his demeanor. It wasn't important. As Jacob turned to leave, the atmosphere in the store seemed to change. The hum of the lights suddenly louder, the air thicker. He moved toward the door, the sound of the helicopter blades now unmistakable, louder than before, cutting through the stillness of the evening. For a moment, Jacob paused, his hand resting on the door handle. His heart beat just a little faster, the memories of another time rushing to the surface. But he didn't linger on them. He opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. The helicopter was closer now. Something was coming. Something had arrived, and Jacob, without a word, knew that this was no ordinary evening. The quiet was about to break. The morning air was still, the kind of quiet that settled over the town like a blanket. It was the calm before something inevitable, something far beyond the boundaries of this sleepy place. Jacob could feel it in his bones, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The mundane routine of the supermarket had momentarily settled into a rhythm, the soft clicking of items being scanned, the rustle of plastic bags, the hum of the cooling units above. But all at once, that fragile silence shattered. The sound came in an instant, as if the world itself had cracked open. A deep, throbbing roar filled the air, the unmistakable thud of helicopter blades cutting through the stillness. At first, no one moved, no one spoke. The cashier, already on edge from Jacob's presence, froze, his eyes darting to the windows. His face went pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the counter. The noise intensified, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the store. Jacob didn't flinch. He had heard this sound before, many times, too many times. It was a sound that always meant something was about to change, something that would pull the past into the present with a force that couldn't be ignored. Jacob turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the sky through the small, fogged window near the entrance. The helicopter was already close, its shape a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. The blades chopped through the air, a shrill, mechanical whine that drowned out every other sound. The air vibrated with its force, pressing against the windows, causing the glass to rattle. People in the aisles looked up in confusion, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and unease. The noise seemed to swallow the town whole, drowning out the familiar noises of everyday life, replacing them with something far more urgent. Jacob knew what was happening before it fully registered in the others' minds. This was no coincidence. He had lived through this kind of thing before, in other places, at other times, during missions that now felt distant but still present in his body, in his memories. He saw the helicopter now, hovering directly above the supermarket. Its massive rotors screamed through the air, pulling everything else into shadow. The giant black shape seemed almost too large for the small town, its presence too overwhelming for a place that prided itself on its isolation. People stepped back from the windows, some instinctively, others more out of confusion than fear. Jacob, however, felt only an old, familiar weight pressing against his chest, as if something that had been long buried was stirring once more. He didn't need to look twice to know what this was. This wasn't just a random military operation. This was a signal, and the signal was for him. He had learned to recognize it over the years, the way the world would shift, how a small moment would ripple outward, bringing everything to a head. It was the sound of change, and it always came with an unmistakable purpose. The helicopter descended, its shadow stretching across the parking lot, darkening the asphalt beneath it. It touched down on the roof of the building with a thundering noise, shaking the very air around it. The blades slowly slowed, the whine of the engines fading into a deep, ominous hum. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jacob's eyes narrowed as the doors of the helicopter opened. He saw them emerge, men in military fatigues, moving with practiced precision. They stepped onto the roof with swift, deliberate movements, their faces obscured by helmets and visors. But it wasn't the soldiers that caught Jacob's attention. It was the figure in front of them, moving with the kind of assuredness that only someone of high rank could possess, a man in a sharp suit, his posture rigid, his expression cold and unreadable, a general, or someone very close to that rank. Jacob didn't need to be told who he was. He had seen enough of these kinds of operations to know. The general's eyes scanned the area briefly before locking onto the supermarket entrance, a silent command that seemed to ripple through the men who accompanied him. Jacob could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent recognition that this wasn't just a routine mission. Something had brought them here, to this moment, to this quiet town. Something about Jacob had made them come. The general's movements were calculated, purposeful, as if every step had been rehearsed for years. He didn't rush, didn't make a sound as he walked toward the edge of the roof, his gaze briefly meeting Jacob's through the window. The briefest exchange of recognition passed between them, a moment that felt like an eternity compressed into a single second. Jacob stood motionless, watching as the military personnel moved with practiced efficiency, securing the perimeter. His body tensed as the helicopter's rotor blades came to a stop. In the quiet that followed, the air felt heavier, as if the whole world were waiting for something that was about to unfold. Jacob's heart beat a little faster. The general didn't make a move toward the door. Instead, he turned, his back to the window, speaking with one of the soldiers. Their conversation was hushed, too distant to catch any words, but the posture of the men, the way they held themselves, spoke volumes. This wasn't just an arrival. It was the beginning of something bigger than a simple military operation, something Jacob had been preparing for, whether he had known it or not. The door to the helicopter swung open again, and more men began to emerge. They moved with quiet precision, clearly trained for this. Their uniforms were sharp, their equipment unmistakable. But what stood out most was the unmistakable presence of authority that followed them. The general, who had now turned his attention back to the helicopter. The mission had begun, and Jacob had a feeling that everything he had been running from, everything he had tried to leave behind, was about to catch up with him. As soon as the general's boots touched the ground, a profound silence fell over the town. It was as though the air itself held its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. People behind the counters froze, their movements suspended in time, their eyes fixed on the figure that had just arrived. The same cashier who had mocked Jacob moments earlier now stood, his posture stiff and eyes wide, unable to look away from the imposing figure of the general. His face, once twisted with sarcasm, had softened into something resembling awe. The atmosphere shifted, a subtle transformation from casual indifference to something deeper, something unspoken. The general didn't make a move toward the door. Instead, he turned, his back to the window, speaking with one of the soldiers. Their conversation was hushed, too distant to catch any words, but the posture of the men, the way they held themselves, spoke volumes. This wasn't just an arrival. It was the beginning of something bigger than a simple military operation, something Jacob had been preparing for, whether he had known it or not. The door to the helicopter swung open again, and more men began to emerge. They moved with quiet precision, clearly trained for this. Their uniforms were sharp, their equipment unmistakable, but what stood out most was the unmistakable presence of authority that followed them. The general, who had now turned his attention back to the helicopter. The mission had begun, and Jacob had a feeling that everything he had been running from, everything he had tried to leave behind, was about to catch up with him. As soon as the general's boots touched the ground, a profound silence fell over the town. It was as though the air itself held its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. People behind the counters froze, their movements suspended in time, their eyes fixed on the figure that had just arrived. The same cashier who had mocked Jacob moments earlier now stood, his posture stiff and eyes wide, unable to look away from the imposing figure of the general. His face, once twisted with sarcasm, had softened into something resembling awe. The atmosphere shifted, a subtle transformation from casual indifference to something deeper, something unspoken. The silence in the store grew heavier as the general continued his path, making his way toward the back of the building where Jacob stood, ever so slightly apart from the others. He didn't look up, didn't make a gesture. He simply continued to watch the general from his corner, the old familiar sense of duty stirring in him once more. He knew what was coming, even if he didn't fully understand why it was happening now, in this small, forgotten town. The general paused briefly, his gaze sweeping the room as though assessing the situation, taking in the faces of those around him, all of whom seemed frozen in place. It was as though he was aware of the weight of the moment, the significance of the encounter. Despite the calmness of his exterior, there was something palpable in the way he carried himself, something that spoke of years of experience in high-stakes situations, in delicate negotiations, and in the pursuit of a mission that required no explanation. He did not need to explain himself, not to these people, not to Jacob. Jacob, however, could feel the pull of something much larger than just this moment, something stretching far beyond this town and this supermarket. It was the sense of duty that had never left him, the feeling that no matter how far he had run, no matter how much time had passed, he was still tethered to the mission, still bound by the unseen threads of the life he had left behind. The general finally stopped, standing near the far end of the store, his presence casting a long shadow over the aisles. The silence deepened around him, a stillness that was more than just the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that preceded something significant, a turning point, a revelation. Jacob felt it in his chest, that strange fluttering in his heart, as if the world were about to shift again, and this time it would not be so easy to retreat from the weight of his past. For a moment, nothing moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigeration units in the back, the occasional shuffle of a customer's feet, but even that seemed distant, insignificant in comparison to the stillness that had settled over the store. Jacob stood still, his eyes never leaving the general's form. The pain, the confusion, the years of questions that had built up inside him began to swirl, slowly gathering shape in his mind. There was a reason why the general had come. There was a reason why he had chosen this moment, this place, to make his presence known. Jacob didn't know what that reason was yet, but he felt it. He could feel it pressing against his ribs, pushing him forward, even as the rest of the world seemed to remain frozen in time. And then, as if on cue, the general's gaze swept across the room once more, locking briefly with Jacob's. It was a fleeting glance, a fraction of a second, but it held more weight than anything spoken aloud. The message was clear. This moment had not been an accident, and whatever was about to unfold, whatever mission had brought the general here, would inevitably involve Jacob. In that instant, the silence in the store became something different. A quiet before the storm, a brief moment of calm before the world changed once more. As the general approached Jacob, a strange sense of quiet settled around them. Jacob couldn't hide his surprise. The general's expression was neither mocking nor cold, but filled with something that Jacob had never expected to see directed at him: respect. It was the kind of respect that Jacob had longed for after years of service, but had never asked for. It was a respect that came not from words or promises, but from a shared history, a mutual understanding of the past. The general moved with purpose, his steps measured and steady as he approached the young cashier. Without a word, he made a simple gesture, a subtle motion indicating Jacob, the silent figure at the back of the store. The young man, who had only moments before smirked at Jacob, quickly averted his gaze, realizing that this time things would not unfold as he had imagined. The mocking tone that had once marked his words was gone, replaced by something else, something deeper, something that Jacob didn't need to see to understand. The general's presence had already changed the dynamics in the room. Jacob could only stand there, watching silently as the general took control of the moment. He felt the shift in the air, the weight of it pressing down on his chest. For the first time in years, his own importance, the quiet significance that had always remained hidden behind his weathered face and unassuming posture, became undeniable. The townspeople, who had once ignored him, now seemed to be seeing him for the first time. Not as the quiet old man from the outskirts of town, not as the war veteran whose name had long faded into the background, but as something else entirely, as a symbol of honor, of duty, of something far greater than the mundane life they had come to know. In that moment, Jacob realized that this was not just about him. It wasn't even about the general, though his presence was powerful and commanding. This was about something much larger, the way that respect and recognition had been so easily forgotten in the small, everyday interactions of life. Jacob had been ignored, disregarded, and left to drift in the margins for so long. But now, the general's quiet authority brought him into focus, shedding light on the silent warriors who had been overlooked, whose sacrifices had gone unnoticed, whose voices had been silenced by time. The general wasn't there to give Jacob instructions, nor to lead him into something new. He was there to remind everyone, to remind the cashier, to remind the people in the store, and perhaps even the town itself, that respect isn't something you ask for. It's something that should be given freely. And sometimes it comes when you least expect it. Sometimes it comes in the form of a general, a man of authority, acknowledging the quiet, invisible heroes who had long been forgotten. Jacob felt the weight of this realization settle deep within him. It wasn't the recognition he had once yearned for, the kind that came with medals or public acknowledgement. It wasn't about fame or being remembered in history books. It was something far more profound, a quiet, unspoken understanding that he mattered, that his service mattered, that his life, though marked by years of silence and retreat, had not been in vain. For a brief moment, Jacob's mind wandered back to the countless days he had spent alone, the empty hours spent staring at walls, listening to the hum of his own thoughts. He had never sought this kind of acknowledgement, had never wanted to be the center of attention. But now, in the presence of the general, it wasn't about seeking attention or praise. It was about being seen, being recognized for what he had done, for what he had sacrificed, even if no one had ever taken the time to ask. The general turned away from the cashier, his eyes scanning the room once more. There was no need for words. The message had been delivered. The room, once filled with the mundane noises of everyday life, now carried an air of reverence, of something unspoken but understood by everyone present. Jacob remained still, his heart beating a little faster, not from fear or excitement, but from something deeper, a sense of acknowledgement that had been so long in coming. He wasn't invisible anymore, not here, not now. The general had given him that. As soon as the general finished his brief conversation with the cashier, he turned without a word and walked back to the helicopter. The massive aircraft hummed to life, its blades slicing through the air with a sharp, echoing sound. Within moments it lifted off the ground, its dark shape cutting through the sky. Slowly, like a shadow disappearing into the distance, it vanished beyond the horizon. The stillness that followed was almost unnatural, as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something that had already passed. Everything seemed to return to normal, but there was a shift in the air, a quiet undercurrent that ran through the supermarket. The customers, the cashiers, and the staff all resumed their activities, but their faces held something different. They no longer moved with the same carelessness or disregard. There was a shared understanding among them now, a collective awareness that something significant had happened, something that could not easily be erased from memory. The general had come, and in his brief visit, he had altered the fabric of their small world. Jacob stood at the entrance, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed on the spot where the helicopter had disappeared. His weathered face was still, yet his eyes betrayed a quiet understanding. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't sought it. But there, in the silence that followed, he felt a profound sense of completion, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. His duty, the one he had lived with for so many years, had been fulfilled. It had not come with medals or public accolades, but in the most unexpected way, through the quiet recognition of a man who understood what it meant to serve, to give, and to remain unseen. Jacob knew that he no longer needed recognition. He no longer needed validation. His presence in the store, the simple act of standing there, had already spoken louder than any words could. The silence he carried with him, the years of service and sacrifice, had resonated in the quiet space between him and the general, and now it lingered in the very air around him. The world had shifted for a brief moment, and in that moment, he had been seen. He had been acknowledged in a way that no one else could have understood. The next time he walked into the supermarket, it would be different. Not because he sought it, but because the quiet strength he carried had already made its mark. The people who had once ignored him, or worse, dismissed him, would now look at him differently. Not with pity or sympathy, but with a recognition of the weight he bore. A recognition of his silence, of his strength. Jacob turned away from the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't need to look back. He didn't need to see the change in the others, the subtle shift in their behavior. He already knew it would be there. And that was enough. His place in this small town, in this forgotten corner of the world, had been quietly reaffirmed. His service had not been in vain. As he walked back to his car, the sound of the helicopter still echoed faintly in his ears, though it had long since disappeared. The quiet hum of the world resumed, but Jacob knew that, for him, something had changed. He had been seen, and sometimes that was all a man could hope for.